All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, December 1st, and you want to talk about Venezuela?
Venezuela. Yeah, that's the war that just won't begin. We've been waiting for it to happen for what, a couple of months now. It's been imminent for a couple of months, and it's still imminent. There there are reports. I think the reports appeared in the Wall Street Journal that Trump actually called Maduro just a few days ago and tried to persuade him to step down. And said that if he did, like if he left the country, he would be guaranteed safe passage, and Venezuela would not be attacked. But I guess we would, uh, you know, the U.S. would essentially take over. They would place their Nobel Prize laureate in charge or something. Maduro refused, according to the reports. So we're still here, and there are again and again there are these kind of signals that an attack is imminent, but we've seen those signals in the past. I think the most recent one was that the United States notified that all really the world that the airspace over Venezuela was dangerous and that no aircraft should enter that airspace, and that lasted for a while. Now that has expired, according to my understanding. So who knows what's going on?
Wait. So that something official that was sent by I get confused by something that Trump just tweets and then something
Yeah,
that
who
is
knows?
there
Who
more
knows?
official channel?
I'll have to admit that I didn't look into it very carefully. So I don't
Because
know exactly what happened. Yeah, maybe it was something that Trump, but
well,
I think
did
it was
you?
more than that. And even if he did just tweet it, um, I did see a report later that there were just no aircraft in the airspace, so it was something that was respected,
Right. I
for at
mean, well,
least a
that's the
while.
thing. If
Yeah,
the
right.
president of the United States says it, then he's just
Yeah,
like, well, that's what I want to talk about a bit. So he put out that tweet a couple days ago. It said, to all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. So, I mean, he says to all
yeah,
airlines, and then he throws in all these illegal things with it. So it's just like, if you're
yeah.
going to go on vacation or you're planning to travel now, it's just like everything is just shut down. How is it possible that somebody has that? Is it really only America that could do that? They could just say like, okay, the one man tweets your airspace is closed down, and then it closes down. I mean, well, it's only
Yeah.
America that would do something so insane. You would never think China
Right.
or
Well,
Russia would send out a
right.
tweet.
Actually, I think it's only Trump that would do something that's so insane. Previous American presidents, I think even under Joe Biden, well, Joe Biden wouldn't even, probably be awake to do it. But his underlings, or the people who are running the show, people like Anthony Blinken, would do it according to proper procedure. But Trump doesn't follow procedure. That's part of what we see. This is just a completely amateurish and chaotic administration that he has. He governs by tweets. And that's an
So,
example. Now, I don't know. Was there an expiration date on that? I may be wrong in thinking that it expired. It might still be in force. I don't know what it means to say in force, but it may be still respected.
yeah, I don't know. That's the thing. I don't know what the hell is going on, but I think
Yeah,
because of that tweet, people assumed that an attack was imminent. Some people say, "Oh, it's going to happen this
right.
weekend or today, tomorrow," and I think just so many of us just like are wondering, still, why is this happening? Why is this
Uh,
going on? Is anybody buying the story of narco-terrorists?
well, some people are. I think some MAGA loyalists, low information voters, do actually believe it. And people who have been affected by the plague of drugs, especially of fentanyl, are are happy when they hear that a boat has been. They think that actually the story is true, that boat was going to carry fentanyl and it was going to kill that person's cousin, and thank God we have Trump and Pete Hegseth and they stopped this boat. But not many people are going to believe that. That's certainly a minority. And you find again the polls are showing that something like only 20% are in favor of military action against Venezuela. The most recent poll that I saw. Yeah,
So,
so who knows? Maybe he's looking at his polls. With Trump, you just can't say. You just don't know, really. Or he's kind of just gets distracted. He doesn't really seem to know what he's doing. He got into this, and then he talks to different people. People tell him different things, and he tweets something out, and then he talks to somebody else, and and he decides to play it cool for a while. And
Yeah.
who knows, say maybe there is some, I'm sure there's all kinds of covert activity taking place in Venezuela, and maybe he's just waiting to see how that pans out. Maybe he's getting reports like, well, looks like we can flip this general or something. I think we can carry out a coup, and he's hoping to do it that way. But it's been a while. I mean, at some point he's just say, you know, shoot those missiles or go home. It's just,
Yeah, I think 3 months ago, I don't think anybody had war with Venezuela on their bingo card. And it just
right,
feels like it came out of left field. Everybody,
right,
we were so bogged down with these dumpster fires in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And just like,
right,
this is just, we have enough horrible war going on. And then all of a sudden, it was just like Venezuela. We're massing troops up there. And I think everyone's like, oh, what's going on? And then some people try to jump on this narrative of narco-terrorists, but I think most people are just like,
right. Yeah,
nobody was
right,
talking about Venezuela 3 months ago, so why
right,
is it all of a sudden a problem now? So
right.
where did it come from? It had, I know there are people within the deep state that wanted to, but part of me just almost thinks, is this just like a Marco Rubio personal project that is being, and that's why this whole thing is happening? It just,
Right. It's
Pete
very
Hegseth
possible.
wants to kill people,
Right.
and like,
Yeah. No, Marco Rubio is one of the most powerful. Maybe you could argue that he's the number two man. He's not just Secretary of State, but he's also National Security Advisor. He has a lot of power, and clearly, he's long had his sights on Venezuela and Cuba, and to understand, and we know why. His background. So it could be, that may be the explanation. He convinced Trump to do this, and which probably wasn't that hard to. You said this will be great. This will be like your obliteration strike in Iran or whatever. And then they got out there and started to realize, this is not going to be so easy. And so there's just a lot of back and forth. Who knows? There must be all kinds of, debates taking place behind the scenes, more than debates, just a power plays. But this shouldn't happen. I mean, again, it's just another, I think, reflection of the general chaos and the amateurism of the Trump government and frankly, his ignorance and his impulsiveness too. We get on to the subject of Trump. I think I might mention, this is something that there was a psychologist from Johns Hopkins University, which is, if not the premier medical university in the country, is one of them. And he came out, with, he couldn't call it a study because he hasn't spoken with Trump directly and performed tests, but he says that Trump is actually showing signs of dementia. And he made it. His name is Johnston, Dr. Johnston. Dr. Johnston has appeared on several shows. He's kind of made the circuit of dissident media, and I don't think he's made it to the mainstream, but he certainly has made the circuit of dissident media. And I saw him on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive show, and Daniel Davis actually showed some clips of Trump from about 4 or 5 years ago. And you really were struck by the fact that he was sharper back then. You could tell, he was much more coherent. And then some more recent clips that weren't, he's not Joe Biden because he has more energy, but it was just so chaotic, just like there was just no logical thread running through anything that he was saying. He's always had that tendency, but it's, he's that kind of person, he just sort of, again, he's impulsive, and I think he always has been, but it was, the contrast was clear. So anyway, there's something to consider, at least to consider here, that, Trump is I think he's clearly in cognitive decline. I don't know how serious it is. I don't know how rapid it is. But that's part of the problem, is that he just doesn't seem to have, he's always had a short attention span. And it seems like to me, like an ability to really focus and stick to something. But all of those tendencies that he's always had have become exacerbated by age.
Oof. Has any country ever had back-to-back full-blown dementia leaders?
I don't think so. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. Really, we still feel like we're in a position that we can lecture the world on the way to properly govern, to run a government, right? There doesn't seem to be like any humility that's come out of this on the part of our elites. And, if you read the New York Times, whatever, you don't see the smugness is still there. There's a sense that, we have the system that really works. All these other systems are second rate and they need to emulate us. There's a complete lack of self-awareness. I remember actually I was reading something, it might have been a year or two ago in the New York Times, talking about defective democracies. There was and they would include Hungary. I mean, I think basically because Hungary has actually, the democratically elected head of Hungary actually does what his people want, but that's defective democracy. That's a whole other issue. But what I would point to is say Brazil. They describe that as a defective or unstable democracy because of the riots that took place, recently after, I guess, Bolsonaro's defeat. That was recent back then. And they pointed to that, again, they weren't really in the club of elite democracies like us. I said, wait a second, like every other day you're talking about January 6th. I think that's greatly exaggerated. It doesn't deserve to be called an insurrection or anything. But if you go on the left and, the New York Times, the liberal establishment, it was an insurrection and the government was nearly overthrown. So why is Brazil a defective democracy, but the U.S. isn't? And now we, like you point out, we have back-to-back, dementia patients, quite possibly. That ought to be, that should at least, lead to a certain amount of humility and self-reflection, and maybe not so much, the certainty that we need to impose our system on the rest of the world. But that hasn't changed.
Well, it explains a lot, at least, because so many times where I'm always asking, why is this happening? Why are these decisions getting made? Can everybody be so delusional? And then it's like, well, okay, if Trump has dementia as well, and all the leaders in cocaine or in Europe are on cocaine, then now we have an explanation, right? Now the delusional thinking makes sense. It's like, okay, yeah, it's either cocaine field or dementia field.
Yeah.
Do you think that? I know I'm being exaggerating, obviously, but
right.
There might be something to it, right? There might be something.
Well,
to it.
I think, in the case of the very chaotic and inconsistent policies, there's no question that comes from Trump and the amateurs that he's appointed. Just his relationship with Russia. We've gone all the flip-flops that we've talked about, which is just driving the Russians crazy, because they like to do things by the book, with experts and so on, and they're seeing none of that. But in general, let's say just the overall policy orientation, I don't think we can point to the personal defects of the leaders. This is something deeper. It is this sort of supremacist, end of history kind of thinking that we've talked about earlier, and that kind of suffuses the leadership throughout the West, including those people who are competent, who actually are intelligent. Somebody like Macron. Macron's got his own issues. I guess they're all kind of weird, but yeah, it's more than just a matter of personal defects and drug habits. But it may contribute to that. Those may contribute.
I think it may contribute to us being able to see under the hood more, because these guys are just, Trump is just shooting from the hip, and he says the quiet part out loud sometimes. And so I think the one thing that is kind of a bit shocking with the whole Venezuela thing is that the regime change is so obvious to most of us.
Yeah.
Usually, the thing is, I didn't know this actually until we've been talking about these things, and I've learned later on in my life that just how involved the U.S. has been in regime changes around the world, these color revolutions, but it was always done a little more sneakily. It was with the CIA, it was funding opposition groups and media and trying to make it look organic, all that. But here it's just We're
Right.
not using the CIA. We're just running straight in blunt force with our military, and
Right.
it's just so apparent.
Yeah.
So I
No, it's very,
yeah,
very crude and poorly planned. It's a very crude gunboat diplomacy. We brought it back. That was something that was really sort of a 19th century imperialist way of doing things. You just send your gunboats off the coast of some poor country and force them to capitulate, to whatever it is that you're demanding of them. And that's what he's attempting right now. Yeah.
have
There's no, yeah, go ahead.
have we had something like that in the past 50 years? Like you said, this was a very 19th century crude policy. Like it just seems like this is different than other regime changes that we've gone through.
Yeah.
We're not trying to really manufacture a very good story for the war. It just seems
Right.
very clear that this is
Right.
just a regime change,
Right.
and we're just open about it.
Well, that's the difference again. It's just in a past regime change operations, we've always been careful to really lay the groundwork, to prepare public opinion, to demonize the enemy. And sometimes that will go on for years ahead of time. We certainly saw in the case of Iran, right? Everybody had been trained to think of the Iranians as fanatic Islamists, that were the world's major sponsor of terrorism, all this nonsense. But so many people have been convinced of that because there's great effort has gone into convincing people of that over the course of years, even of decades in the case of Iran. Now, that none of that was done in Venezuela. It just Venezuela has been described, I think, very unfairly. You can point the figure at the government and say they've had some stupid economic policies and whatever. But if you're going to talk about economic collapse or poverty in that country, you need to mention the fact that we've imposed these very severe sanctions on them. I just noticed in the discussions, this place is a basket case because of the terrible government. I said, well, couldn't our sanctions have something to do with that? That rarely enters into the discussion. But that's not really preparation for the kind of attack that we're seeing. Again, I think everybody was surprised to think, oh, I didn't know that fentanyl was coming from Venezuela. Most people look at it and say that's nonsense. Anybody who knows anything, who is at all well informed. They haven't prepared the public for this, and that, I think that's part of the problem. It was just done impulsively.
Well, what has Venezuela or Maduro done that's so bad that we would want to regime change them? Well, what is it that is it just the type of government they have, or is it the fact that they're sitting on all this oil? But why wouldn't we just work with them and buy the oil and develop it like a normal country?
Right. Well, I'm sure that the oil does factor into this. I think it's mainly a matter of geopolitics. It's just the fact that Venezuela is allied with Russia and China. I think that's probably the main reason for putting a target on Venezuela.
Allied how? Like militarily, or is it economically, ideologically? I mean, what is
all those things. All those things.
Is it a formal alliance essentially, or is it just that they're
I don't. Yeah,
more in that group? They sit at the
oh
same
yeah, they
table
certainly
kind of
are.
thing?
It's just like the Russians and the Chinese will speak up for the Venezuelans and vice versa. In the United Nations and just in general in the press. The Russians and the Venezuelans have cooperated militarily. The Russians have provided them, sold weapon systems to them. The Chinese may have as well. I'm not quite sure about that, but the Russians certainly have. And so, this is not surprising. It's just that, again, there's this is, everything really comes down to, in so many cases, to geopolitics. Everything else seems to go out the window. We pretend that we're concerned about Nazism or we're concerned about Al Qaeda, right? But when push comes to shove, it's all about the geopolitics, and that explains, what happens in places like Syria or Ukraine or wherever, and I think in Venezuela too. is that, okay, they are an ally, or, maybe, not a formal ally, but an unofficial ally. They are allied with Russia and China. And they are here, within our part of the world. That makes them, uh, well, that means they have to go, according to the American way of thinking, the kind of the imperialist American way of thinking.
Well, I mean, Brazil is part of BRICS and a bigger ally, right? But is that just too big of a country for us to bully around?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's probably, we certainly have our favorites within Brazil. Well, I know Trump was very closely allied with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was actually called like the Trump of the tropics, but anyway, let's set that aside for now. Yeah, Trump. I mean, rather, Brazil is too large. I think you can't really bully them, and they haven't been as outspoken as Maduro and Chavez before him. They have been very outspoken, kind of the rather fiery rhetoric. They do position themselves as inheritors of this revolutionary tradition in Latin America. And and Brazil is a little bit more careful. They're kind of like India, for example, in their policy. They don't want to unnecessarily anger the U.S. They refuse to bow down to the U.S., and they insist on maintaining their good relations with Russia and China. But they try to maintain, friendly relations with the U.S. Sometimes it's a challenge, but they do. Venezuela is not that way. Venezuela has just been rather openly hostile to the U.S., just on a rhetorical level. It's not like Venezuela presents any threat, any kind of military threat to the U.S.
We've talked before how Gaza and Ukraine have really sapped the United States of its soft power and its military power. Ukraine more so the military power, Gaza the U.S. soft power. Is what we're doing here in Venezuela, is this really etching away at these pillars that we talked of U.S. hegemony as well? Like, is this
Yeah.
really hurting our soft power, especially throughout the whole Latin American region?
Right. Yeah, no, I would say um, the way this is being done. Again, it's so crude and it's so out in the open. There was always you could have a pretense. I think, again, people look closely at a lot of these things. They realize, the CIA was involved or whatever. But in general, there was some kind of deniability, plausible deniability. For people who didn't want to look too closely, they could ignore it. But this one you can't ignore. This is out in the open. This is just crude gunboat diplomacy. That's what it is, and everybody knows it. And again, I think that really has to hurt the U.S. It may, they may succeed. I certainly hope this doesn't happen, but they may succeed in carrying out a regime change operation in Venezuela. I don't think they will, but they could. That Venezuela it is a very poor country. Its military is much weaker than the U.S.'s. Who knows, maybe these decapitation strikes will occur and they'll take out the leadership, and they have a well-planned, coup in place, and they'll install their Nobel laureate puppet. Now, that may just quite possibly will just lead to years and years of chaos and civil war, and the U.S., can't prevent that. But in the short run, it might succeed. They would take this Bolivarian regime out. But I think no question that's going to create a lot of anger throughout Latin America. There's already this sensitivity. There's this history of bullying, and there are memories that are still really rather fresh. Of U.S. interventions in places like Chile and Guatemala and many countries in Latin America. And this is going to make those wounds, sore all over again. I think, in other words, it's going to hurt U.S. soft power, especially in Latin America, but around the world. Again, it's just people will look at that and say, this is not really a country we want to emulate. We may have to put up with them because they're powerful, but let's start looking at alternatives. This is the process that we already see that is underway throughout much of the world, and this will only accelerate that process.
Right. I think it's interesting to think about the observers of this conflict around the world, or just the people observing how the United States is behaving around the world. So many people prior to everything that's happened the past 5 years, 10 years, they wanted to emulate the United States. And we would just assume that the U.S. had the best system and there wasn't really an alternative. But right now, I think so many people are looking around. They say, okay, the BRIC system is better. China, for example, China, maybe they have a better system, and that our system has failed. But there's a problem, because at one time, our system was the superior system. We were better, and China's system was a mess. It was chaos, under Mao Zedong. But the thing is, our systems, we have kept the same terminology. Even though that back when our system was working and now it's not working, and then when China's system wasn't working and now is working, we still say, oh, we have a capitalist system and China has a communist system, for example. And I think that's a problem, right? Like when we start to look, because things have changed. I feel like China isn't really communist, the U.S. isn't really capitalist, but we largely have kept these two names, and people are looking around like, well, the free market capitalist Western system is garbage. Clearly, it didn't work, but it doesn't work. But it did work at one point in time. It's not working now because something's different. And then the communist system that China had in the past wasn't working, but what they have now is working. So how do we deal with that problem? The terminology, like
Right.
what is the best system? Like, or does China have a better system? Like what should people emulate?
Right. Well, I'm not one that, insists on the superiority of one system. We do in the West, we say that's really in a way what this whole conflict is about. We have the best system. It's the end of history. There's nothing better, and the rest of the world has to accept it. That's the supremacist, hegemonic kind of thinking that we have. But the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, they don't say that. That's not the argument they're making. It's just like, oh, we have the best system and you have to copy ours. We have, if you don't adopt our system, we're going to carry out a color revolution in your country. No, each of these systems is really quite different. And so the argument that let's say on the ideological front, the points that the Russians and the Chinese and others within that, let's say, that loose collection of allies and partners, they're saying is, again, we're talking about multipolarity. We're talking about allowing each country to go down its own civilizational path. And that's what we stand for. Now, it's interesting that actually and I think that's right. They're describing the reality. This is a realistic assessment of what they're looking at. And what they're fighting is this insistence on imposing one system on the world. So that's how they frame it. And I think they framed it correctly. That's what's happening. On the other side, they are, I think, as you say, are living in the past. It's just like, I remember the days of the first Cold War. It was the free world. We often refer to ourselves, it was the free world against communist tyranny. And there was, it was somewhat exaggerated, but there was a lot of truth to that. And both sides actually understood what it was about. Yeah, we're about communism, socialism on this side. You're about capitalism on that side. And that's the fight. And everybody understood it. So in a way, there was an agreement about what the conflict was about on both sides. But this time, I think you can say that those who are in the multipolar camp, are framing it as multipolarity versus Western hegemony. And I think they're framing it correctly. But on the other side, we insist on talking about a fight between democracy and authoritarianism. But the other side is not insisting on authoritarianism. I think it's fair to call, for example, definitely it's fair to call the Chinese system authoritarian, But as you pointed out, it's also very, very successful. And you can say from your own experience that most Chinese are very, very happy with the way things are working there. I think there's much more support for the government there than there is, for example, within this country for our government. And then the same with Russia. It's described as authoritarian, and Putin's a dictator. He's obviously not a dictator, and it has some authoritarian elements, I think you'd say, but there's also a lot of democratic elements, and it's its own thing. And again, it seems to be very successful. And you look at what's happened over the last 25 years under Putin, and people are very happy with it. Again, I can speak from direct experience, especially through your sister who's lived there for 5 years. So it's not, and nobody on that side is saying we're insisting on authoritarianism. There are other people within the alliance, like India and whatever, that are, very much democracies. And, so it says there's no argument on that side against democracy. When people are brought into BRICS, they say, oh, you're a democratic country, we can't bring you in here. No, of course, there are democratic countries that are brought in there. There are also monarchies that are brought in. There are authoritarian countries, that are brought in. There's all kinds of countries. It is about multipolarity. It's about, true diversity, civilizational, political diversity. So we're not, on our side, we are living in the past. We've kind of reverted to this old rhetoric. It's freedom versus authoritarianism. I think also we're not looking at what's happening within our own countries. Because increasingly in places like, especially Great Britain and Germany, there are growing authoritarian tendencies and real crackdowns on free speech, that are, according to many measures, you can say there's more freedom of speech in Russia than there is in England or Germany, for example. But we don't, again, I don't think we're being honest about it. We're not framing it honestly. And then when it comes to countries like Romania, Moldova, clearly our commitment to democracy is, let's say, highly qualified. So I'll say it's just a false framing on our side. And it is a kind of a refusal to recognize the new realities. We are living in the past. So yeah, we often, especially in the conservative side of the spectrum, when we talk about China, it's always communist China, communist China. We both know enough about China that it's communist only in the name. It's led by the Communist Party, but they have pursued a radically different policy from what was pursued under Mao Zedong and the Gang of Four. And it's again, only communist. It's in name only. There's plenty of capitalism, plenty of free enterprise, and even a celebration of traditional thinking and so forth. All of those things which you could never have found under the Communist Party as it was founded. The original one that ran China for the first few decades after the Communist Revolution. It's something else entirely now.
Yeah, I like how you said just about this false framing, this lens that how we look at things, in the rhetoric that we use, the language that we use, and I realized I was just always thinking that it was the elite that had this hegemonic thinking, but I realized that it all trickles down to all of us here in the West. Because we use that language, and I even think about it sometimes like that. Okay, we're using the term communism or authoritarianism, freedom, democracy. It's just so part of our vernacular but us in the West, we're the only ones that are thinking about it that way. Oh, there's this authoritarian government and it's communist here, and you see it just every time you turn on the news. Communist China. They're doing, and just sort of indoctrinating all of us. Like, oh, there's this big ideological fight, but the ideological fight is only for us on the West. Nobody in the others, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you doing? We're doing our own thing here. Nobody's bothering you, and we're just framing it all as us versus them. That's how everything is. So it's that the terminology is so important. The language that we use, but I don't know if we can change. We can't change that, right? I mean, we need to update these terms because people are still stuck in that. It's just, especially the boomers. You're an exception, and not all boomers. I know we have a lot of older people watching the show as well, but a lot of people, they're just sort of stuck in the past. It's just like, oh, it's the commies versus the free world.
Right. I think you find that's true, especially among older conservative people. They still seem to think that the great threat is Marxism. Marxism is really gone. It died a long time ago. Um, and yeah, it's a whole new world that we need to wake up to.
Do we need to update these terms? But we can't
Yeah.
do it. It just will
Yeah.
have to naturally. What point? Because these terms are so outdated, but they've long lived past their applicable, usage. In
Yeah.
time, I feel like 20, 30 years ago, maybe you could have been using some of these terms more, but now it's just something different. But we're still using them.
Right. Well, it's a problem if you're part of the elite here, because how do you frame it? Do you say, we represent hegemony, Western-led hegemony? Occasionally it slips out, like, Boris Johnson actually said it once, and, every once in a while it'll slip out, but that's not how they want to present it. So they do have to, in essence, lie about what they're doing.
How about they stop talking about it altogether? And just be
well,
like,
then,
hey,
how do you
help
lead
our
your
country.
crusades? How do you launch your wars? You have to have something, ideology is really very important. They have what I would say is just sort of, if you look at it strictly, they are very inconsistent about democracy. Again, I mentioned Moldova and Romania. In other instances, Gaza. When Gaza held an election in 2006 and Hamas won, then we immediately clamped down and said we don't recognize that. It's about outcomes. And, we've talked about what's happened in Georgia, too. It's just like if the wrong person gets elected, it's not a democracy. So it's this Western ideology that has, social, political, aspects to it. In the end, it's just like being part of the Western club and accepting Western values and accepting leadership of the EU and above all the United States. That's really what it comes down to. But you can't really frame it that way because, that's just not going to win you a lot of adherence, and it's going to, it'd be an admission of really what you're doing. You're trying to impose one system on the rest of the world. So they continue to use these, speak of these universal values. Say it's about democracy, it's about human rights and that kind of thing. When clearly it isn't. I just gave you like, we know what's happened in Ukraine and in Gaza and whatever. It's just the opposite of that. But that's going to be the language that they're going to continue to use. What other language can they use?
Interesting. So really that, that language, human rights and democracy, authoritarianism, that's really the language of modern day imperialism, modern day U.S. hegemony. That's why we use it, right? I mean, if we didn't have the desire to expand and stir up all these other things, we wouldn't be using that terminology, because really it'd be like, why are you talking about that country in the first place?
Right.
The only reason you're using these words is because you're trying to continue to project U.S. hegemony, trying to project dominance, primacy. It is that's just imperialism is just evolved into this new thing where we use language and we don't die, we let other people die. We just use the language,
Right.
It's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, for example, we use human rights as an excuse for doing all kinds of military interventions and regime changes. It grows out of the right to protect. That's something that came out of the unipolar moment. This right to protect position or thinking that, which actually went very much against the old understanding, which dates all the way back to Westphalia and to the United Nations too. It's just that countries are sovereign, and we have to respect their sovereignty. Otherwise, we won't have any peace. We can't intervene in other countries because we don't like them or we don't like their political systems. That was the understanding that actually goes all the way back to Westphalia in the 17th century, and which has been kind of reincarnated in the last century as the United Nations and international law. But the right to protect, it sounds good to say, well, if, we can't use that as an excuse, respecting sovereignty. If a country is actually persecuting certain people in their country, they're violating human rights, we need to intervene. And that was used in, for example, in Serbia. It turns out on false pretenses. That's what happens. The thing about it is it's used very selectively. This idea that's in general what this rules-based international order is. It's an alternative to international law and sovereignty and multipolarity. It's okay. We're the international community. We get to set the rules. Nobody really knows exactly what the rules, but we set them selectively. It's like we're concerned about human rights here, but not about them there. And when you do that, when you apply some kind of standard very selectively and inconsistently, what are you doing? You're weaponizing that particular, argument. Right. So the right to protect. Okay. That sounds like a reasonable position. But you don't apply it consistently. You just apply it here and there, and you often on false pretenses, you've weaponized it, and you now have a weapon, in your arsenal for intervening, for attacking countries that are not, compliant. One good example again is Serbia.
Yeah, so we're weaponizing all these things that are supposed to be great and holy kind of parts of our way of life, or things that like human rights. That's something that's supposed to be that we should all get behind of, but we weaponize it. We've tainted it, and we weaponize democracy, as well. Just all these things we've
weaponized the dollar.
The dollar. Well, I mean, I think this is things like democracy or human rights. I think that's why they have been able to be weaponized, because they're shrouded in that, that protection of like, this is such a great thing, you got to be behind it. And we've just made it into such a terrible thing. It's a real shame. It's another dark mark on us. The more I kind of realize, it's like, man, this whole thing was all sinister. the language you use, what the pretexts and the pretenses we used to go to war. And now we're off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, is this going to happen? Do you think we're going to do this for democracy,
I think
for
so,
human
but,
rights, for freedom?
Yeah. Well, in this case, we use that language in reference. We say that he's legitimate. He stole the election, that the people there are oppressed, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it is about this. The main focus here has been on the drug trade, which is just entirely false.
What do you think the soldiers and the sailors, what do you think they're thinking? Do you think that they understand? Because if the vast majority of Americans are like, this doesn't make any sense, I'm sure they have contact with their family. Are they being just sort of fed some propaganda, Maduro horror snuff films, like on the boats to just be like, gear them up, be like, this is why we got to kill these people? Because I haven't... it's not a normal. I just feel like I would be asking questions on this boat. I'd be like, wait, so
right? I'm sure.
Why are we here? Why are we attacking? I mean, are there hearts in it? You got to get that morale up, right? How are you going to do that in a case like this?
Yeah. Well, I just don't know. I'm sure there are some. I don't know how many are questioning it. From the experience of past wars, I think we can say with confidence that a lot of them are. Many of these military personnel are waking up to the reality. And certainly when it's all over, they will realize that they were used. A good portion of them will. I just don't know how large that proportion is going to be.
Okay, well, let's move over to Ukraine a bit while we still have some time. Let's start with, well, you wanted to talk about Yermak, you mentioned. So maybe we'll start there, and then I want to move over to what's been going on in the Black Sea.
Okay.
So let's just take it.
Sure. I think as everyone knows that Yermak has been removed from his position as the head of the office of the president. Now, that's not on paper a particularly powerful position, but everyone has known for a long time that Yermak is a very powerful man. And many say that he's actually more powerful than Zelensky, or was more powerful than Zelensky. That he was the real power behind the throne. So this is very significant, on one level anyway. This is a real blow to Zelensky. Zelensky, has fought tooth and nail to keep him there. He's been closely tied to him. In the past, he said that basically if Yermak goes, I go, and all that. I trust him utterly. He gets things done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's done nothing but protect them and sing his praises. But the pressure was such that he finally told him he had to go. And apparently the meeting where Zelensky told him that, if these reports are true, went very, very badly. And that Yermak was furious about it. Yeah, so that's interesting. That's it shows that there's something going on. I think everybody agrees that it's not simply, an objective investigation going forward. It's in Ukraine. It's never about that because everybody is corrupt, and it's just a question of who you prosecute. Why are they going after these people rather than other people? And there are a lot of theories floating out there. I've discussed some of them in the past. One of them that's kind of gained ascendancy recently is that it's the U.S. that's behind this. Because they're saying that, okay, they're trying to weaken Zelensky so that they can get him to accept their deal. And some very, smart people like Mark Saboda and Marta Havrisko, the two people that I follow, have made this argument and believe that to be true. And they may be right. I have my doubts about it. Partly, again, this investigation began a long time ago. And Zelensky could see it coming long before the U.S. had put together this most recent 28-point plan or anything. And if you remember, it was maybe 2-3 months ago that he tried to take over NABU and SAPO, the anti-corruption agencies, and then had to back off really because of pressure from the Europeans. So that's one thing. It's just that this has been happening for a while. I don't think maybe the Americans moved in and tried to take advantage of it, but I don't think they're behind the original investigation. Again, it's over the last couple of years, or this recent year, because of the cuts in funding carried out by the Trump administration, these agencies, and NABU in particular, are largely funded by the Europeans, and they have European influence. Another reason that I'm doubtful about the U.S. story is that the people that staff these agencies are in general kind of the Western-oriented liberal nationalists within Ukraine. And these people are actually particularly pro-war and against negotiations. Again, this is the kind of topsy-turvy world that we live in. But so it's hard to believe that these people would be willing to try to weaken Zelensky in order to get him to agree, to some sort of settlement, because they have been, opposed to that from the beginning. And again, it's the people in the agency, the Europeans, that support them. Now, I know, like Mark Saboda, I bring him up again because I think he's very good, and I rarely disagree with him. But he was saying, well, look, there were these negotiations in Geneva, and afterwards, Yermak was kind of bragging about how he got the Americans to back off and to to water down all of the demands that they had made. And then, bam, Yermak is gone. So it looks like the Americans got rid of him. Again, he might be right. But what I'm saying, but when I look at that, I see that, well, wait a second. So the Americans backed down. They couldn't actually stand up to Yermak directly. They were negotiating with him. It was actually Secretary of State Rubio right there. So you almost have to say that maybe Trump doesn't have control over Rubio and those negotiators, but somehow he has control over NABU, which is rather incredible. Now, that might, in fact, be true, in this weird world that we live in and the chaos within the Trump administration. But it seems to me that, again, already the Americans have backed off so much. I don't see a coordinated play to get Zelensky to pressure Zelensky to accept the settlement. So what's going on? Again, maybe the Americans are behind it, or at least a part of this. I'm not going to entirely discount that, but it seems to me it's probably more likely internal Ukrainian politics, which, as I've said before, Doesn't mean that we have, like a new faction that has a whole new set of policies and priorities coming to power. In general, they're all pretty much on the same page. But their personalities are people that hate each other, enemies of Zelensky, like Poroshenko or is one example, but there are many. He's got many enemies, and these people and Yermak has many enemies. There are a lot of people that hated him, and so it just may be that like these networks of individuals within Ukraine, with the backing of like factions within Europe, are just weakening Zelensky. The idea a lot of people believe, and I get it. By the way, I should mention. That I get a lot of my best information on Ukraine from the blog Events in Ukraine, which is something I can very highly recommend. Very, very detailed analyses of what's going on. But according to, that blogger and others too, and quite a few, it's just that the belief is that, okay, they're probably not going to try to take out Zelensky, but they just want to weaken him so they can gain more influence over him because, again, he's a useful figurehead. But with Yermak gone, he's severely weakened, and you'll have to maybe rely on, people within these other factions or these other networks within Ukraine.
So what's going to happen to Yermak?
Well, yeah, he says that he's going to go off to the front. Very few people believe that. He may be making that statement because, according to Ukrainian law, if you do enlist in the military, then you can actually gain immunity. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now, something that everybody should be aware of is that actually NABU, again, this is the main anti-corruption agency that was created after the coup in 2014. It has never actually jailed anybody. So it's been there for, 11 years, but it's never jailed anyone. It's been used as a political tool in the past. It was used that way prior to Zelensky's election in 2019. They went after Poroshenko, who was Zelensky's opponent then. And, not so much directly, but, the people around him in the same way that they're doing now. And they weakened Poroshenko, all these revelations about corruption, among his cronies and his aides and so forth. And that helped Zelensky to achieve a very resounding victory over Poroshenko. So I don't know that Yermak is really in danger of going to jail because nobody ever has gone to jail over these, these corruption allegations.
I mean, like you said, basically everybody in the elite there in Ukraine is corrupt, and it's just who they decide to shine the light on when they want to get rid of somebody.
Yeah.
But I imagine Yermak as the right-hand man of Zelensky and the one that's supposedly, the real power in Ukraine, he's got to be full of state secrets, right? Isn't there a danger? You get rid of this guy, you get mad at him, he could spill the beans, do some real damage. He can lend to more infighting, and then just the political elite within Ukraine begin to eat each other alive because everything's falling apart. Everybody's looking for different scapegoats and blaming other people. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, well, I think, I'm sure that the developments on the battle lines are affecting the atmosphere there. And probably all in all have weakened Zelensky. I mean, it's just that he does his best to hide the failures, but they have become increasingly difficult to hide. His own popularity has dropped down to something like 20% in polls. And I'm sure, again, the way the war is going is a big part of that. Interestingly, like just before the SMO was launched, he was down to 20%. He started off very high. Again, he was the peace candidate. He was going to implement the Minsk Accords, but it was a combination of the ultranationalists who threatened him with violence. There was one that actually, maybe it was the head of the right sector, that said anybody who tries to implement the Minsk Accords will hang him from a tree. But then also the NABU kind of people, the Western-oriented liberal nationalists, they declared that this was, it may have been NABU itself that actually declared there's a red line, no Minsk Accords. So anyway, yeah, I was just kind of going off on a tangent here. But he was very popular when he was elected as a peace candidate, and then over time, his popularity dropped, and he was down around 20% when the SMO was launched. But then he was able to present himself as the Churchill of Ukraine, to his own people and to the West, and his popularity soared. But now it's falling down, is way down to 20%. So yeah, I think he's weaker, he's vulnerable. His many enemies have become aware of that and maybe decided this was the time to strike.
Okay, well, one development in the war is in the Black Sea. There were two tankers that were hit over the weekend or up on Friday. Can you tell us about that? Whose tankers were these? Whose boats were these? And who blew them up?
Yeah, I know at least one of them was under the state of an African, under the flag rather of an
I want to
African
say
state.
Gambia or something
It
like
sounds,
that.
yeah,
I want to say one of them.
or
Yeah, I know
Ghana
one
or
was an
Gambia,
African
right?
state.
Right.
Yeah.
It could be, yeah. And the other, I actually don't know. Something similar. It was not a Russian flag tanker or a European flag tanker. It was some, smaller third world country. I think that was operating, or at least had their flags flying over these tankers. And they were in Turkish waters, is my understanding, in the Black Sea, and they were heading towards a port, a Russian port. And it's not even, yeah, I think at least the reports are that they were going to pick up Russian oil. That's what they were doing, that they were going to, they were going to be loaded with Russian oil and then leave the Black Sea. But before they got there, they were struck. And it's clear, and there's no question about it, that it was the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians actually released video footage of their drones striking at least one of the tankers. And then later, the announcement was made. They did it. So that is, very serious escalation. And we'll see what happens. It's very dangerous. The Russians can't let that continue. That could really harm them. You think about it. If ships begin to fear that they can't actually even enter the Black Sea, that's going to make it more difficult for Russia to export oil. It'll do more harm than real sanctions would. So they can't let this simply continue. Now, they certainly can retaliate. They can just shut down shipping to Ukrainian ports, like to Odessa. And that would, again, be very detrimental to the Ukrainians. They do receive a certain number of arms. They're not supposed to be shipped that way, but everybody knows that a certain amount of weapons do get shipped across the Black Sea to Ukraine. Occasionally, the Russians will strike those shipments when they're being offloaded at the port in Odessa. But beyond that, we're talking about economic war, and the Russians could respond in kind and say, okay, no more grain is going to leave Odessa, and in general just shut down a big part of the Ukrainian economy. That could be the response. I think, the Russians would be reluctant to do that, but if this continues, I think they almost would have to do that.
Why would Ukraine release footage of it and take credit for these strikes? Because you struck, civilian vessels that are not even owned by Russia. These aren't Russian tankers, and even if they were, they're civilian. So you've just opened. If you didn't announce it, you could try to give some plausible deniability and said, "Oh, Russia struck its own, struck these tankers to give it a justification as a false flag or whatever to do something." But now that they've done this, Russia will say can like you said, just be like, okay, well, if they're doing this, then we'll shut down Odessa's port. Ukraine, no more shipments into Ukraine.
Right. Well, I think part of it is, they actually want to announce to their supporters in the West, especially to the Europeans, look, we can hurt Russia. And they know that the Europeans really have no respect for international law. They've shown that. That international law has long gone out the window. They're just supporting Ukraine to the hilt. And this would be, I think another way of just saying, hey, we're still in this fight. We can hurt the Russians. And you have so many within Europe who are trying to shut down exports of Russian oil, through one means or another. And then the Ukrainians say, hey, yeah, look, we really can do it. We're doing it for you guys. Now, so I think like vis-a-vis the Europeans and probably the Americans too, it doesn't hurt them. It might actually help them. But vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and especially the Turks, it's got to hurt them. The Turks have to be very angry about this. Apparently, the Kazakhstan is actually quite upset about this because some of that oil that is loaded onto ships in the Russian port is actually from Kazakhstan. There's a pipeline that runs from Kazakhstan across Russia to that port. And so there's even a chance, I don't know if this was true in this case, that those ships were going to pick up Kazakh oil. In any case, there have been attacks, and there was one very recently on that pipeline and the facilities that are attached to that pipeline, the Kazakhstan pipeline. And so the Kazakhs are very, very angry about it.
Do you think this kind of gives a green light to the Russians who say, okay, well, we got to take Odessa to, make sure that Ukraine doesn't have the Black Sea coast?
Yeah, well, I think that's a further demonstration of like something we were talking about earlier, that they really need to take Odessa, because it's a lot of the damage that Ukraine can do is actually through their access to the Black Sea. And if the Russians can deny them that access, they will have seriously weakened Ukraine. At least, they will have made it much more difficult for Ukraine to harm Russia.
Has Russia made any statement about this incident and about any steps that they might take, or are we still kind of just waiting?
I haven't seen anything about steps. They certainly have condemned it, but they haven't threatened any retaliation to my knowledge.
Do you think it's partly because there's, some pretense of some type of negotiation? I mean, are they even involved, or are the Russians just kind of watching the Americans just scramble around with this plan? I mean, what's happening here? Is there anything actually going on?
Okay, well, we had that meeting in Geneva, where according to the rumors, it went from a 28-point plan to a 19-point plan that was much more favorable to the Ukrainians. Now we have a meeting going on in Florida. It's not at Mar-a-Lago. It's actually, I think, it's Steve Witkoff's place. I guess the most recent report was that, it's been constructive. We made progress, but it's clear that they haven't reached an agreement there, the Ukrainians and the Americans. Now, there are some American representatives that are supposed to appear in Russia, I believe, tomorrow, to meet with Putin and Lavrov to actually present something to them there, and we'll see what happens. Again, it's just the whole thing is so chaotic, and even the one like the most favorable versions of the plan, which probably don't exist anymore, were still unacceptable to the Russians. I don't see any chance that the Russians are, going to accept anything. I think this is just the amateur show of the American State Department right now.
Is Rubio getting more involved in this? Because prior, it used to seem like it was more Steve Witkoff was more the Secretary of State than Rubio was. Rubio was often just absent, and we knew that he's very hawkish. He's a classic neocon.
Right.
Is he being involved in this process? And if so, does he seem to also be willing to try to make it work?
I don't know. He was. You have to have your doubts about that. I think he's one of those people that is always pushing the neocon position. He can't do it too openly when Trump instructs him otherwise. But he was there leading the negotiating team in Geneva. I believe he was there also, or at least he gave a statement. I don't know if he was down in Florida, but he certainly gave a statement afterwards about it. And I think there's a chance that he may be going to Russia now. He has been involved in it, in varying degrees.
That seems to be a bit different than what we've seen.
Right.
Part of me is thinking this is what's going on, is that Trump is like, he really doesn't want this war in Ukraine. He's been using Witkoff the whole time. And now you need to use your Secretary of State at some point, right, to make anything kind of official. You know,
Right.
you need to have a real team to plan this out. So maybe he's telling Rubio, is like, look, Rubio, get this deal done somehow, and then you can have your war in Venezuela. I'll do it. Just settle this. We can't do both, right, buddy? So you get this,
Yeah.
and then we'll go there, you know?
That is, I think that's very much within the realm of possibility. I don't, yeah, I could
Now,
actually
Rubio
see that
seems more
happen.
motivated than he's ever been.
Yeah,
you know?
right. Hey, it could be. You know, you might actually be right. I mean, really, I haven't heard that, but I like that.
Well, we'll
You know,
see.
he's not
But
going to get it for him, but he's got to at least make a show of making a big effort to get it done.
Right.
Right.
Well, if that is the case, then maybe we won't have this war in Venezuela because, like you said, Marco Rubio isn't going to get this deal, right? It's we've talked about this before. You still feel the same way.
Right. Right.
This isn't going to happen. It's going to nothing. Russia can't trust anything that the U.S. presents itself, even if they do try to capitulate to all of Russia's demands. There's nothing that the West can do to guarantee that they'll actually be true to their word now. So I think, like you said, they're going to have to go on, take Odessa, connect to Transnistria, and just wait till there's, a white flag waving, total capitulation from Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, they may not even get that total capitulation. That Western Ukraine may just go on fighting. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen. It would be good if they had that, and then Russia could actually carry out denazification or debanderization, and I think that could lead to real peace. But that's, unfortunately, I don't think that will happen. I think that they will continue to fight. They will continue to receive support from the West to the very end. Not to the point where they can stop the advances of the Russian, but they can make it costly, especially when you get into Western Ukraine and where the local population really is quite hostile to Russia. At least it is now, So I think most likely it will end as a frozen conflict. The Russians will go to where they need to go to and then just stop. And then finally there will be that ceasefire. That's not the ideal outcome, but I think that's the most likely outcome.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else you want to go over, Dad?
I don't think we need to go over anything else today. We can get into, what's happening on the front lines maybe tomorrow, and we can go back to what's happening in the Middle East tomorrow. Or not tomorrow, but rather Wednesday. Right?
Wednesday. Okay,
right.
Sounds good. All right, then. We can end it there.
All right.
Okay, have a good rest of your day. I'll talk to you
too.
soon, Dad.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.